Welcome, everyone. My name is Tani Schwartz-Herman. I'm a program director in JTS's Department of Community Engagement. So pleased to welcome you to the final session in our summer series, JTS Alumni in the World, Scholarship and Impact. We're so pleased to have today with us, teaching today, Dr. Ora Horn-Prouser, an alum of JTS's Kekst Graduate School and CEO and academic dean of the Academy for Jewish Religion. Our session will be a new understanding of Betzelem Elohim, biblical texts through the lens of disability studies. Thank you so much to our generous sponsor for today, Barbara Hoffman, at the Chacham level, who sponsored today's session in loving memory of her daughter, Carolyn Chaya Hoffman. If you're feeling inspired by this opportunity to learn with JTS's outstanding scholars, we invite you to partner with us by sponsoring a learning session. We offer 3 sponsorship levels, Chacham at $540, Sadiq for $1,000, and Navi at $1,800. And we're going to be posting a link in the chat as to how you can learn more and sponsor a session. I also wanted to share with you that we have, following this, the ending of this webinar series, we're going to be having our High Holiday webinar series in September, 3 Mondays. The topics will include repentance and the divine human relationship, and also we'll be also talking about some of the things that are coming up for us as we approach the anniversary of October 7th. We're pleased to have Dr. Shira Billet, Rabbi Michal Springer, and also Chancellor Emeritus Dr. Arnold Eisen will be doing a book talk on his new book, Seeking the Hiding God. And we're going to be posting a link in the chat as well as to how you can register for our new webinar series. Just to go over the format for today's session, Ora will be pausing periodically throughout the class. We'll have some time for Q&A at the end as well. Please use the chat feature to submit your questions to me. And during the Q&A period, I will select a few of the questions to present to Ora. Since we receive a lot of questions, kindly express your question both clearly, in complete sentences, and also concisely. For any technical or logistical questions, please initiate a private chat with Stacey Firestone. The sources for today's class were in the email that you received earlier today. We'll be screen sharing them as well. I'm so pleased to introduce Dr. Ora Horn-Prouser, CEO and academic dean at the Academy for Jewish Religion, a pluralistic rabbinical, cantorial, and graduate school in Yonkers, New York. She has published widely on the Bible, focusing on disability studies, gender issues, and literary analysis. Her book, Esau's Blessing, How the Bible Embraces Those with Special Needs, was recognized as a National Jewish Book Council finalist and as a gold winner in the 2016 Special Needs Book Awards. And I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Ora.
Thank you so much, Tani. Thank you for inviting me, and thank you, Stacy, for all you're about to do to make this work. So thank you so much. It's really very nice to be here. I also want to correct one thing. I'm actually an alum not only of the graduate school, but of what we used to call joint program, and now is List College. So I'm very happy to share that a whole lot of my education was at JTS. So I'm just appreciative of all of that. And I also want to recognize my parents are here. So Rabbi Bill and Dina Horn. So it's very nice that you're here. And I recognize at least one AJR alum here, but the screen is too many, so I'm sure I'm missing people or not, but Jerry Blum, it's nice to see you. And so thank you. So, well, and I'm sure there's other people I know here, and if I miss you, it's too many screens and too much to read quickly, so I hope you understand. The other disclaimer I want to put in is I have this lingering cold, and so if my voice sounds funny or if I'm blowing my nose a lot or taking drinks, I just am going to assume that you'll all understand and be very glad that we're not in the same room, so you're not catching anything. So thank you for your understanding. So I kind of see this in several parts. I want to start by talking in general about the cross-section of biblical studies and disability studies. And that's where I've done a lot of my work over the past good number of years and where I'm still working. And so I want to start with talking in general terms. And then if you looked at the source sheet already, you'll see that we're going to spend time looking at the character of Moshe. And we're going to spend some time on Moshe. And then we're going to do some where do we go from here? And then move into some bigger picture about God and Betzelem Elohim. So those are kind of the three parts of this. And I'm kind of planning to stop for questions in between each of those parts. I'm not going to see the questions. Tani is seeing the questions. So she will pass them on, but if it takes a few minutes for us to get to them, you'll understand what's coming and where we'll get to them. But please ask away because that's how we all learn and that's how we bring it together. So to get us started, when we think about biblical studies and disability studies, what does it mean to bring those two together? And what does it mean to read the Bible through the lens of disability studies? So for a long time, when we thought about the Bible, no one really spent time thinking about disabilities. Or when they did, they came into play in very small, specific areas, as opposed to having any larger impact. For example, there may be a text where we know that Jacob can't see and crosses his, and how he blesses his grandchildren, and we know he's not seeing well, but we don't think beyond that chapter, or we used to not think beyond that chapter. But what does it mean if we think more broadly about the question of biblical studies and disability studies? So if we think, for example, even just starting in the book of Genesis, there's a fair number of people who are living with various kinds of disabilities. For example, we have Isaac and later Jacob are both blind. Now you can say blind later in life, right? Both of them, it seems to be a later in life issue, but they both have, it has an impact on their experiences that they are not able to see. We have Jacob, who limps after wrestling with the angel. What do we do with that? We have Moses that we know doesn't speak well. We know from his own words and we know from God's response to Moses' words. So Moses, the greatest spokesperson of the Bible, certainly the Torah, but I'd say the Bible without any hesitation, doesn't speak well. We know that Leah has weak eyes. We don't know what that means, but whatever it is, there's something with Leah's eyes, right? So it's actually kind of, if we're just looking at disabilities that are overt, right? Ones that the Bible specifically tells us someone is dealing with a disability, there's actually quite a few. And it's interesting that for so long, we kind of didn't focus on it, or we focused on it in very, very limited ways, but not beyond. But what's also very interesting is that these people are not victims. They are not the nebuchs of the community. These are people who are active, who are strong, who are change makers, who are history makers, right? These are our main people, our main characters in the Bible. And they are dealing with different kinds of disabilities. When you look at many other ancient texts, what you see is that the people with disabilities are kind of on the outskirts of the community. They're, you know, sometimes they're actually left in the outskirts in a very dangerous way, like left to not succeed or not to live, frankly. But even when they're part of society, they're outside. They're not the central figures. They're certainly not the heroes of the text. And yet that's not what we see in the Bible. And so it is really worth our time to figure out, well, what is going on in the Bible? Like, why are we looking at so many of our important biblical characters who are dealing with a variety of disabilities? And I do want to repeat that in the few times that we have focused on them, we have not focused on them in ways that look beyond the text there where their disability is mentioned. So as an example, we know that Jacob limps after his struggling with the angel. But I've read very few people who actually think about that limping in the rest of Jacob's life. And we go right from there, pretty soon afterwards, into the story of the rape of Dinah. And so many people write about, well, how come the Jacob, who was so strong and so powerful, so active before, right, in his earlier life, suddenly in the story of the rape of Dinah is not active and is not playing a strong role and is afraid and is letting himself be walked over in a way and is not willing to do anything till his sons come home, right? That's the Jacob we see in the rape of Dinah. And what does it mean to think about it in terms of, I mean, let me start that sentence again. Many people look at that and say, well, what's wrong with Jacob? He doesn't care about his daughter. He doesn't care about what's going on. He is just dismissive of this whole story. But if we think about it in terms of Jacob himself being a different person in this time than he was in those earlier stories, when we think about Jacob not having the same ability to fight, to walk comfortably, to represent himself with great strength, it changes the way we read the story, right? Suddenly it sounds more logical that he's waiting for his sons to come home because maybe he doesn't feel comfortable. Maybe he doesn't feel safe. Maybe he doesn't feel like he can accomplish it on his own. So this is an example of where we take the issue of the disability and look beyond the text where it's located and see how does it impact on the rest of the text. So what we're going to be doing is to think hard about, well, what does it mean to read a biblical character and see how does reading through the lens of disability studies impact on the reading of that character. Okay, so I know we just started, but I'm going to stop for a minute and make sure you're with me. Is everybody with me? Are we good? Yeah? Some thumbs up? Okay, good. Okay. So I would like to go to the source sheet. And we're going to be looking at the character of Moshe together. And we're not going to read every word, but I like to have it in front of you so you can really get a sense of the text and look at it. Everything on the source sheets, by the way, is straight out of the Tanakh. So if it's easier for you to look at your own Tanakh or anything like that, feel free. It's the same thing, okay? So feel free. So if we look at the first text, and by the way, I know they're out of order, it's on purpose. But if we look at the first text, which is in Exodus 4, Shmot Daled, this is where we have our introduction to Moshe really talking about his difficulty. And this comes after the the burning bush, right? We just have the burning bush, and this is still part of that text. And God is trying to get Moshe to be willing to lead, right? And Moshe is finding reason after reason why he shouldn't be the one. And he says they're not going to know who I am, and they don't know who you are, and why should they listen to me, right? Like Moshe's giving reason after reason why he should not be the one to lead the Israelites at this point. This should not surprise us, by the way. This is the normal biblical response, is to say, no, I don't want to. It's very, very rare in the Bible where people say, yes, they want to. They do generally have to agree later. But this is like a normal biblical response. We should not look down at Moshe about it. By the way, I see like a typo in the Hebrew on verse 10. So sorry about that. So Moshe finally has given up, so to speak. He every response he's given to God has been dismissed, right? And God has had an answer to every response that he gives. And finally, Moshe says, Bi Adoni, לא איש דברים אנוכי, גם מתמול, גם משלשום, גם מאז דברך על עבדך, כי כבד פה וכבד לשון אנוכי. This is verse 10. But Moses said to God, please, Adonai. It's like a, like a very pleading approach. I have never been a man of words, now or before, and I am slow of speech and slow of tongue. I always feel that when we read about this, what we're seeing is Moshe being stripped away of everything else he tried to say. In other words, he didn't want to talk about the fact that he was not comfortable speaking. He tried as hard as he could to give every other reason why he can't speak. And God just dismissed all of them, almost like, pulling away the layers until all that was left was Moshe's real inner self. And that inner self was saying, I can't do this because I don't speak well. And that was something he maybe felt from the beginning, but was trying so hard not to focus on, and trying so hard to find every other reason to say that he couldn't speak. And if you're making believe you don't know the story, which is always hard, but always worth it, you may say to yourself, like, what could God have done here? Like, what would be a good response to this question, to what Moshe just said, right? Clearly, Moshe is struggling. Clearly, he's upset. Clearly, he has just like shared his deep guts. And when I think about it, and think for yourself what you think, but when I think about it, this would have been a good time to say, don't worry, Moshe, you can do it. Or I'm with you, I'll help you. Or anything that kind of gives him a sense of strength in his sharing of his fears and sharing of his struggles. And I just come into this when I make believe I don't know it, kind of expecting some support and expecting something a little bit warm and fuzzy. But what do we get? We get Vayomer Adonai Elav, verse 11, Mi samper la'adam, o mi asu milemo cheresh o pikeach o iver, halo anochi Adonai, ve'ata lech. ואנוכי אהיה עם פיך, והוריתיך אשר תדבר. So God's response is basically, you think I don't know this? Who do you think made you this way? Who do you think makes it that people have trouble, that people are dealing with disabilities? God, I'm the one who does this. So you think I didn't know this before I asked you? If you wanted to, or not if you wanted to, asked you or demanded of you that you take this role? And I find that so powerful. And then God says, now just go. Like, you have to do this. Go. And I'm going to support you. I will be with your mouth. I'll make sure you know what to say. right? So there is some of that chizuk, that strengthening in God's words, but it also comes with I know this, because the way I read this verse, sometimes it feels to me like, Moshe, that thing that causes you so much pain. And this is, remember, God's introduction with Moshe. This chapter is just their introduction, meeting each other. That thing that makes your life so hard? That thing that really makes you uncomfortable? Well, I did that to you. And that's what God is saying here. Now, it also comes with, if I'm the one who did that to you, I can help you past it, or I can, we're not dealing with something that we can't take care of. So I get that. But there's a little bit of a push in here that feels a little bit borderline harsh. And Moshe still responds, like, just do whatever, let's please just do something else, please ask someone else. And then God gets really mad. And God says, okay, I'm really mad at you, but I'm going to help you. And I'm giving you basically a crutch. And Aaron is going to be your spokesperson. And he will speak for you. And you'll be glad that you have him with you. And I like this section here where it says, Hu yehiyeh he is going to be your mouth. Ve'ata tihiyeh lo Elohim. And you're basically going to be a God to him, right? So you're playing the role of God, and Aaron is playing the role of your prophet, so to speak, your mouth. And later on, it does use the word prophet. So this is, and then Moshe recognizes he has nothing left to do and it's done. And Moshe has to say yes and move forward. And at least he has the support from Aaron that he will need in order to do this in a way that's comfortable. And what he has told us in essence is that Moshe needs to feel human support, right? It's not enough for him to feel divine support. He needs to feel human support. And that's what God gives him here. So this is our beginning, right? This is our beginning of understanding Moshe. This is our beginning of understanding Moshe's relationship with God. And when they get to their deepest place, what they're talking about is Moshe's difficulty in speaking, okay? And remember, his job's going to be to go speak to Pharaoh, right? That's going to be his job. And he has already shared, and God said that God knew that he doesn't speak well. Okay, let's keep going. We're going to come back, don't worry. Like, we're going to bring this all together, but let's just look at some more text. So now I'm going backwards a little bit. This is because I always thought it was important to start with that burning bush episode. But here's something, now we're going to let's look at some stories about Moshe. And what I want to share as the overarching picture here is that when we think about Moshe, right? Moshe is supposed to be the biggest spokesperson and speak to Pharaoh and speak to the Israelites and speak. But when you really look through the text, and I know in synagogues right now, we're reading the book of Deuteronomy. And the book of Deuteronomy has Moses speaking for the whole book, right? So the book of Deuteronomy, we really do see Moshe speaking. But if you pull out Deuteronomy, which is really different in so many ways, in the rest of the Torah, Moshe actually speaks very little. He speaks to God a lot, but speaking to God is just different, right? Like, it's not normal speech. But in terms of speaking to people, over and over, we see either Moshe uses very few words, or we see that he does what he can to use like political theater instead of speech. So let's just look at some text to see how that works. And this is an example. This is very early. This is one of the first texts after Moshe's birth that we see. And this is when he went out and he saw two people in a fight, basically. And he saw an Egyptian beating an Israelite. And his first response in verse 12 is he acted, right? He looked this way and he looked that way, and he basically killed the Egyptian and buried him. Didn't say a word. There's no language in this section. And then we have Moshe go out a second day, and this time he sees two Israelites fighting, and he says in verse 13, Lama takeh re'echa. 3 words. Why are you hitting your fellow person, right? I know that's 4 words in English, but 3 words in Hebrew. Lama takeh re'echa. That's all he says. And then he realizes they know what they, in their response, that they know what's going on, and that's what leads him to run away from Egypt. But right away, we see in just this text, we see 2 things. First, Moshe acts without speaking. And second, that when he does speak, very short. Okay, 3 words, and he's done. And let's keep going. And by the way, I'm going to say one more thing, which is what we're doing here is an example of exactly the opposite of what I said in the beginning, which is that in general, when people look at biblical characters with disabilities, they don't think about the impact of that disability beyond the one place where it's mentioned. So I think this is a good example of it, where plenty of people talk about Moshe not being able to speak, right? Like that's just standard knowledge. It's standard part of knowing about Moshe. But how much do we read that we really hear about how that inability to speak impacts on the rest of his life? Right? We hear about it in chapter 4 of Exodus, but how much do we think about that in the rest of the Torah? So that's what we're doing here is let's look at how it impacts on the rest of Moshe's life. So if we look at the next text, which is also part of Exodus chapter 2, but this is after Moshe runs away, right? So Moshe runs away from Egypt, he runs to Midian, and he does the standard thing of meeting his wife at the well. Excuse me, sorry. So he goes to the well, and this is a standard trope that we have in biblical texts, right? A lot of our patriarchs met their wives at the well, right? It was like a standard thing. We know this happened with Jacob. We know that Isaac's surrogate met Rebecca at the well, right? So this idea of meeting your wife at the well is something we see elsewhere. So here too, he's at the well, and this is where the daughters of the priest of Midian are there, and they are being attacked basically, or threatened. Let's at least say that they're threatened. And Moshe, in verse 17, Vayakom Moshe vayoshian vayashket sonam. And Moshe comes and saves them, basically. He saves them from these, at best, people who were making them uncomfortable, at worst, people who were attacking them, and took care of their flocks as well. He took care of their flocks as well. And then the next thing we know, the daughters are going home to talk to their father. So think about this little scene, right? And think to yourself, do you remember the scene of Jacob meeting Rachel at the well? And the whole emotional time of finding out that they're family, and there's crying and there's love interest, and Jacob, you know, showing off his physical prowess, and right, it's a whole big scene with lots of talking. Think about Abraham's servant at the well meeting Rebecca, and how Rebecca talks to him and says, well, he asks a question of Rebecca. Rebecca says, of course, and let me water all your camels for you, right? Again, lots of talking. But what we have here is Moshe rises to their defense, you know, quite noteworthy and praiseworthy, and saves them. No talking. There's no talking going on here. And they go home. And their father says to them, so like, no, what happened? Why are you here? And they said, yeah, this guy saved us and, took care of our sheep. So we got home really quickly because this guy saved us. And their father says, so you just left him there? Like, well, what is this? You just left him there? What is this? And go get him and bring him home. And of course they do. So their father asking that question really points to the fact that something odd happened in this interchange, right? That is not what you would expect from an exchange of somebody who comes and saves you and takes care of your sheep, and there's no talking, there's no exchange, there's no anything. So that's just the logic part. But from a biblical, literary biblical standpoint, one of the things maybe many of you or some of you have heard of before is what's called a type scene. And a type scene is some kind of scene, like a story that we see over and over. And meeting your wife at the well is a really great example of one, that it seems like the same story, but it's different in each case, right? And usually what you learn the most from is what makes this story different from the other ones. So as an example, Isaac is one of our very passive in many ways patriarchs. That's the only case where a surrogate did the meeting instead of him, right? So that stands out, that that difference is so noteworthy and really points to our understanding of Isaac and understanding Isaac. So here, so too, I mean, this could obviously be a much longer conversation, but I think you're getting the idea. So here, what stands out? What stands out is no talking, that this is all action, and almost weirdly no talking, right? That it feels absent, and their father doesn't understand how it happened, that this guy met you at the well and did all the right things, and neither one of you talked to the point where he came home with you, which is what we would all expect. So here too, we have Moshe being a really good actor. And when I say actor, I don't mean like theatrical. I mean a really good person who acts. Excuse me. But at the same time, is not using language the way we would expect from someone like that. Let's keep going. Here we are in Exodus 6. And this is a section where we already have Moshe leading. Moshe is already talking to Pharaoh, okay? And asking Pharaoh to let the people go. And Pharaoh is responding by making it even worse for the Israelites, okay? And Moshe, if you look, and Moshe was talking to the Israelites, and Lo sham'u el Moshe mikotzer ruach ume'avodah kasha. But they wouldn't listen to Moses. Here it says their spirits crushed by cruel bondage. Nice English. But I would say that we might have something else here. Because what's kotzer ruach? Kotzer ruach is kind of like, there's two ways we can translate this. One is from impatience, right? So they didn't listen to him because they were impatient and they had so much work to do. So if you think about it as Moshe not being quick to speak, if he is taking his time in speaking to them, which may be if he's chvad peh, chvad lashon, right? He's slow of speech and slow of tongue. Maybe they literally didn't have the patience to listen to him and didn't have the time to hear what he had to say. The other way I play with this verse is, who does the kotzer ruach refer to? Because is it literally lack of breath, right? And I knew somebody who had a speech problem, and what their therapist told them was, you're not organizing your breath. You're not organizing your speaking. You're not organizing how you use breath. And so that's the other way we could play with this, is the kotzer ruach, the shortness of breath or the lack of breath, referring to Moshe. And that Moshe is not using his breath properly to be able to express himself. But either way, they're not listening because they either are impatient or they don't get it from him or he's not speaking well, whatever it is. And God then comes right back in verse 11 and says, go talk to Pharaoh, okay? And you go to Pharaoh right away. This is the next verse. And Moshe says to God, the Israelites are not listening to me. It's like, they're not listening to me. There's no way that Pharaoh's going to listen to me. I have a speech problem, right? So what I feel is going on here is that Moshe tried to speak. It didn't work. And he realized that it didn't work. And it feels like God pushed right away and said, no, 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 you can do this. Here's what I want you to say. And Moshe's response is, I can't. And I think this text emphasizes a push-pull that is happening in the whole story of Moses, which is that God keeps wanting Moshe to speak, and Moshe keeps saying that he can't, and getting his point across in other ways. And I think this is just a really, really good example of it. Let's go on to the next text. Now we're already in the book of Numbers. And this is a time of struggle, right? The people are all upset once again. It's like the whole book of Numbers is like that. And Moshe is now crying out to God. Vayomer Moshe Adonai, lama hare'ota le'avdecha? Why have you made my life so terrible? V'lama lo matzati chen beinechen? Why don't you like me, basically? V'sumet masa kol ha'am hazeh alai, that I'm bearing the burden of this people. Ha'anochi hariti et kol ha'am hazeh, im anochi yelidetahu. Did I give birth to these people? Did I, is it my job that I'm responsible for them? That I'm told that I have to carry them the way like a nursemaid carries a baby. So why is this significant? This is because Moshe is now describing his job. And how does Moshe describe his responsibility for the Israelites? He describes it as carrying them, having the burden of carrying them the way you carry a small child or a baby, right? That's how he sees and how he describes, let's say, what his job is. You with me? I keep calling him the greatest spokesperson, but he doesn't, right? He calls himself someone who's responsible for carrying the people. But then just the next chapter, which is another whole story of struggle, this is where God describes Moshe. And this is when Aaron and Miriam are saying that they should be equal to Moshe. And it's a big story. We don't have to go into it right now. But God is saying, no, 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 no. You think you're like Moshe, but you're not like Moshe at all. Usually when I talk to prophets, I'm talking through a vision, I'm talking through a dream, it's not so clear. But lo chen avdi Moshe, this is in Numbers 12, excuse me. Lo chen avdi Moshe, b'chol beiti ne'emanhu. Moshe is different. He is the most loyal, most trusted. Pe el pe adaber bo. I speak with him mouth to mouth. Umar evelo bechidot, not with surprises or riddles. Utmunat Adonai yabid, and he sees God. He really can see God. And why weren't you afraid to talk about Moshe this way? So notice that Moshe talks about himself as carrying the people, but God, when God talks about Moshe's role, it's pe'el pe'adaberbo. God says, no, no, no. I speak to Moshe mouth to mouth. So God really emphasizes that Moshe's job is speaking. Moshe thinks of his job as carrying, and God speaks of Moshe's job as speaking. Okay, so again, we're building a case here. I know we're going text to text and we're going to make time for questions, so don't worry, but I want to do just this one more, and then we'll come back to it and we'll bring it all together. But we finally have the, I think, most important text, which is the hitting of the rock, right? And that's in Numbers 20. And this is when God, we already had earlier that Moshe was told to hit the rock, right? That's in the book of Exodus. There was an earlier time where Moshe was told to hit the rock, and he did hit the rock, okay? And water came out. Big success. Here we have something else. God says, take your stick, but go and talk to the rock. I'm in the very beginning, verse 8. Talk to the rock with dibartem el hasela le'enehem. In front of all the people, you need to talk to the rock, and the rock will give water, and there will be enough for everybody and the animals. And Moshe took the stick, just the way God told him to, and brought the people together. It sounds like he's doing it right? Like God said, take the stick, he took the stick. God said to bring the people together, he brought the people together, right? We're being built up. Again, you have to make believe you don't know the story, but we're being built up to expect this to be successful. And then I just lost my place. And then he goes in front of the rock and does start speaking, but he says, Shim'u na hamorim. Listen, you rebels. Hamin hasela hazem notzila chamayim. Are we going to be able to bring water out of this rock? And he hits the rock, and he hits it twice. And of course, water does come out with enough, but God's very angry and says, because you didn't trust me, but didn't believe in me enough, you are not going to be the ones who bring the Israelites into the land. So this is kind of this culmination of the time where Moshe this is this culmination of the push-pull between God and Moshe about speaking. That all this time, God has been pushing Moshe to speak. And all this time, Moshe has been saying no. And at this moment, God kind of puts it all on the line. It has to be public. It has to be, it's this real moment. The people need water. They need to be brought this water. And Moshe can't do it. The few words he says, how many words does he say? Shimuna hamorim, hamina sela hazen notzila chamayim. 9 words. It's still under 10 words, right? It's always very few words. You know which text I didn't bring in here is when Moshe is praying for his sister, right? We always look at, El na rafana la. It's so beautiful. 5 words. El na rafana la. 5 words, and they're each 1 syllable. Right? So it's, again, we always have this very few words, and Moshe has shown that he is still in that place where he can do actions, but he can't be the spokesperson. And he does the actions really well, by the way, right? There are many, many places where he does beautiful political theater, but God is kind of saying here, political theater is not what we need right now. We need a spokesperson. And you can do it, Moshe, right? Like, I'm here with you. You can do it. And pushing all along and can't do it. And God recognizes that. And this is where God says, you can't enter the land. And I'm going to take 2 more minutes, and then we'll open up to questions because we just did a lot. And this is one of those really, really painful places in the Bible, because so many of us read this and think Moshe has been really pretty amazing through the desert period. First in Egypt, being willing to face Pharaoh, and then leading the people through the desert, struggling. It was not easy, right? Moshe did and did and did. And to be told after all that, that he can't be the one, feels like a horrible, horrible punishment, and is very sad, right? And we don't understand it, or many people don't understand it. And people give all kinds of answers, like, how does this make sense? Why would God have done this? And, did Moshe not give God enough credit? Did Moshe not trust that God could act, right? Like, there's all kinds of questions like that. But those don't really work for me, because he has spent this entire desert people showing the people his faith in God, right? And trusting God right and left. So all of a sudden, the people don't believe Moshe anymore. Like, that Moshe feels this way anymore. It feels hard to me. So when I read this, I actually read it differently. And that is not as a punishment, but rather as a consequence of his not being willing to speak. And God basically saying, Moshe, I still love you, but you're not the one to enter the land. And when we leave the desert, we're going to need a leader that talks. We're going to need a leader that talks to other peoples. We're going to need a leader that does more than political theater. And you're not that person. But make no mistake, God still loves Moshe. If read the end of Devarim when Moshe dies, it is this intimate, the definition of dying with a kiss, right? Is the end of Devarim. And God buries Moshe, right? That's this beautiful intimacy between God and Moshe that is not lost after this text. So this is not a punishment. I hate you. I want nothing to do with you. This is you're not the one. And yet I see your values. I see how important you are. I see your strengths, but you're not the one who can do the next thing. And it reminds me a lot of the story of Elijah. That in the story of Elijah, right, we know that Elijah was able to do all these miracles, and Elijah had real powers, however we want to define that. And yet Elijah basically was so frustrated and so upset and felt so abandoned. And he had this big episode where he won a contest basically against these priests of Baal, and Elijah won, and it should have been a great moment. But instead he runs away, and he basically ends up at Mount Sinai, even though it's called something else. And he needs to be strengthened. And God then talks to him and says, what are you doing? Mata sepo, Eliyahu, what are you doing here? And Elijah says, Kano kaneti ladonai, I am so zealous for God, and no one cares about God but me. So God says, okay, stand here. And God basically does a whole private revelation to Elijah. And it involves the storm and the wind, right? It's a private revelation. And that's where the still small voice comes from, right? We know that story, right? And God is not in the storm, and God is not in the wind, but God is in the kol dmama daka, a small, still voice. And that's where God is. So God gives Elijah this private revelation. And then God says again to Eliyahu, exact same language, Ma ta'osepo Eliyahu, what are you doing here, Elijah? And Elijah answers with the exact same words, Kano kaneti ladonai, I am so zealous for God, and no one cares about God but me. In other words, he was unchanged by this private revelation. And God's answer is, okay, go anoint Elisha. this is not telling Elijah, I hate you. This is not saying, Elijah, you're a terrible person. It's saying, still, Elijah goes up to heavens in the fiery chariot. Nobody else does that, right? So there's still a care for Elijah, a love for Elijah, but you're not the one anymore. You can't hold it. You can't be the one to lead if even after a private revelation, you can only feel alone and abandoned. It doesn't work. And so I think in both of these texts, and probably in another one as well, we really see this sense of there is a way to say you're not the one without saying, I hate you and you're terrible. And I think that's what we see here with Moshe. And God tried really, really hard to get Moshe to be the one to speak. And God worked at it with him. And Moshe couldn't get there. And remember, Moshe's like 120 at this point. Even take a few years away, he's 115, right? Like no matter what, he's at an age where maybe it's too late for him to totally change his nature. But I think that's what we're seeing here. And I have found renewed attention, at least personally, to this text in our current political climate, where we had a president be told, you're not the one, or who had to be able to say, we love you, we care about you, you do so much, and you've had such a career and such success, but you're not the one to carry on for the next time. And so I have felt renewed attention to these sections in our current climate. And I think it's so important to make sure we have both parts of it, which is you're not the one, and at the same time, I love you. And I have such respect for all you've done. So I want to take a break. And so if we can, yeah, thank you. So we just said a lot of things. So let me open it to some questions or comments.
Thank you so much for sharing your methodology with us, and such a really insightful approach to reading the text. I'm just going to remind everyone that if you have questions for Aura, you can chat them to me, please. Um, I'm I'm actually wondering, and I think I may know the answer to this, but do we know anything about how Moshe responds? You know, kind of what's his reaction to that? And I don't think we do, but I'm just sort of raising that as
It's a really, you mean to the hitting of the rock
yeah, it's
where
a
you are?
you know,
Yeah.
I think you offered such a beautiful approach that, you know, but you know, sort of how does Moshe take that? You know.
Yeah, we don't really have much at that point.
Mhm.
We have more conversation between God and Moshe in Devarim, where Moshe is fighting for himself a little bit. So we do have some of that in Devarim when Moshe does push to be able to enter the land. But in this text, we really don't have it in the same way. You should know it also is a whole section of rabbinic literature that has Moshe appealing to God in different ways, for all kinds of things, including, really fighting to be able to enter the land. So we do have it almost, recognizing the lack of it right here. We have a whole lot of it in rabbinic literature. But in the biblical text itself, we really don't have a lot of it.
Yeah. I did have sort of a comment, and you'll correct me if this is, you know, not true, but you know, that soon after Moshe begins to lead the people, that he does do a lot of speaking, and that soon after that Aaron, you know, maybe helps him right in the very beginning, but then he is doing a lot of the speaking, and again, correct me if that's not true, but that was one of the comments that we received. So
Yeah, sometimes we have Moshe and Aharon speaking together.
mhm.
so when we have the two of them speaking together, truthfully, my own reading of that is that it's really Aharon speaking in the same way that imagine someone who's deaf who is using an interpreter, right? We how we attribute that speech. Well, it's not a great example, but I think when we have Moshe and Aharon speaking together, then I personally read it as, Aharon representing Moshe and doing the speaking. When we have Moshe speaking himself, it's very few words. And we have all kinds of places where he acts and said, I mean, think about things like Moshe fighting, representing the people to fight, right? They're in a war and they win when he has his hands up, right? So it's political theater. And remember, it's so hard for him that he has to have people on either side of him holding his arms up in order for him to be able to keep his arms up so they keep winning. Again, it's theater, right? Think about what he did when he came down from the golden calf. Excuse me, not from the golden calf, from Mount Sinai to see the golden calf. He shatters the Ten Commandments, right? So what we really see much, much more is action. And if you go back and really look, if it says Moses and Aaron said it together, that's one thing. And then to me, it's really Aaron speaking for Moses. But when we have Moses speaking alone, it's really very short or not at all. And it's actions. And it's remarkable because you don't notice it until you actually sit down and read the whole text with this in mind. I didn't, I assumed that Moshe spoke all over the place. And then when I actually sat down and just read with this one thing in mind, it was very shocking to me how little Moshe actually speaks on his own.
Yeah. Another question that came up was kind of the various places in the Bible that have restrictions with people with disabilities, such as in the temple and in various texts. So curious to hear your reactions to that.
Yeah. So that is a very difficult question. It's a very painful section. Let's start with that. There's a section in Leviticus that really lays out all the qualities of people that would not be eligible for temple service, so to speak. And it's a whole long list, frankly, of physical issues. And frankly, it includes things like having a broken limb. Like a whole lot of us have broken limbs before, So it's not even this esoteric list of things that only a few people might have, right? It's actually a very broad list, but it's a very painful section, and there's no two ways about it. And we should acknowledge that, like point blank, we should acknowledge it. What do we do with it? So I have different things that I do with it, but I'll give you two examples or two ways of thinking about it. The first is that sometimes I'm much more troubled by commentators to the Bible than I am by the Bible itself. And commentaries on that section often talk about God's perfection and that non-perfect people cannot draw near to God. And I find that really offensive too, that people with disabilities are referred to as non-perfect people, right? And that's, by the way, by the commentators, right? That's not by the text itself. The text itself never, or doesn't refer to it that way. So that's just one thing I want to say is that sometimes I think we mess up by how we talk about the Bible more than what the Bible says itself. That's one thing. But I want to say something else, which is what we see in the Torah is that Moshe, our greatest spokesperson, can't speak. Jacob, our greatest patriarch, whether he's your favorite or not, he's the father of the 12 tribes, right? So he's kind of the most important patriarch in many ways. If you want to make a big case for Abraham, you can. I'm not going to fight it. But at the very least, he's one of the most important. And he walks with a limp, right? So how interesting that two of our most important biblical leaders are dealing with physical disabilities. And so sometimes I think that in the Bible, we have narrative texts that in essence argue against the legal text or the cultic texts. And I think this is one of those cases that on the one hand, the cultic law is that people with these disabilities are, unable to fulfill certain priestly functions. And it's offensive. Please understand that I'm not trying to say it's not offensive because it is, right? But on some level, the narrative texts are telling us that people with disabilities that wouldn't be allowed right in that list, or because of that list, are actually among our most important biblical leaders. And so on some level, the narrative text is arguing against the cultic legal text and saying, yes, we have that list, but look at real life. Look at the real life people. I mean, and when I say real life people, I'm not saying they lived or something. I'm saying, the story. And you can decide for yourself how you feel historically. But that is giving a very different picture. So I think there's something to be said there as well. There are other ways to think about it, but I think that at least gets us started. But it's a good question and a very legitimate point. Like,
Thank you. Thank you for offering that response. So I have a couple other questions, but I think we should probably keep going and then leave some
okay,
time at the end. So thank you.
sure. Okay, so we looked at Moshe. We've talked about biblical characters. So from there, in my own work, I've taken another step, which is really looking at the character of God in the Bible. Now, I want to be clear. I follow the view that I look at the God of the Bible differently than the God that is my personal view of God and the God that I pray to. In other words, I'm looking at God as a character in the Bible, how God is portrayed by the authors of the Bible, whoever they were and whatever they, were doing, whatever time period. There are a lot of different ways of thinking about this. Everyone can have their own view, and that's perfectly fine and good. And I'm not here to push my view over anybody else's. I want to be really, really clear about that. But I just want to share a view of thinking about God in the Bible as having disabilities. And let me explain another thing about what I'm saying, because I know this sometimes gets a little hairy. God in the Bible is portrayed using so many different metaphors, right? We have God as king, God as spouse, God as, ruler. I'm sure I'm not coming out with all the words right now, right? But God is so many ways of thinking about God. And each time we really feel like we're seeing a little piece of God. We in the Bible, in the biblical view, are not capable of seeing all of God, right? We can't get the whole picture of God, but we can see a little piece at a time. And that's all we can see. And each time we learn something different about God, it's helpful, right? And it's valuable for us. For a long time, everybody thought about God in the Bible only using male terminology. And then people came forward and said, but wait a minute, if you actually look at the biblical text, there are female images for God. Professor Phyllis Tribble was really at the forefront of this. She taught at Union right across the street from JTS. She was one of my professors in graduate school. And she was the one who said, we have images of God crying out in labor pains. You know, that is female. You can't help it. That's a female image. So if we just didn't look for it, we didn't notice it, but it was there. So the question is, and it just because we were at a different place in our understanding of gender, that we were able to absorb it differently. Okay, and that was looking at feminist studies of the Bible. And I think there's the same thing we can do in terms of disability studies. So if we can go back to the text, Stacy, and we're looking at Psalm 23. So the 23rd Psalm is a psalm everybody, uses in all kinds of times looking for solace, often used in funerals. And this is the Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want, right? And if we look through it, it's a psalm filled with divine metaphor, right? It's very pastoral, right? God as shepherd. If you look elsewhere, there, you spread a table for me in full view, right? So it's God, and it's a different metaphor. You anoint my head with oil, a different right? So there's many metaphors for God in this psalm. And one of the famous lines, Gam ki elech, verse 4, Begetzal mavet, lo irara ki ata imadi, shiftecha umishantecha, hema yenachamuni. Though I walk through the valley of deepest dark, I fear no harm, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And again, it's a very pastoral image of the shepherd, right? With the shepherd's crook. But I was once reading this at a time where I was dealing with issues of not being able to walk well. And I looked at the words, Shiftecha mishantecha hema yinachamuni. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. And I really thought about it, that mishantecha is actually something, a stick that you lean on, right? Something you lean on. And a stick that you lean on is a cane. So what if we read this as your cane, your rod and your cane comfort me? Like I am comforted by the idea that God sometimes walks with a cane. Now, to be clear, this does not mean, from the way I'm reading it, people can do it the wrong way. From what I'm reading it, this does not mean that God always walks with a cane. God still walks in the garden. God still, in the Garden of Eden, right? We have God walking in the Garden of Eden. We have God soaring through the clouds, right? We still, excuse me, have all of these different views of God, moving and acting and walking and traveling, right? But what if we add this one more metaphor to our view of God and say God also walks with a cane? And that's another view of God. 1 second, please. Yeah. And what if we add that to our understanding of God in the Bible? If we keep going, just to give some other examples here, so just go down a little bit. There's a wonderful book written about thinking about God from the perspective of a blind person. And a blind person wrote this book. I think he called it like A Blind Person Reads the Bible. I think his name is David Hull. And he uses these examples down, lower down on the page, Psalm 8, Psalm 97, and Job 22, where he talks about thinking about God in total darkness, right? There are verses that talk about thick cloud beneath his feet, right? I can't see. Shamayim vayered ve'arafel tachat raglav, anan ve'arafel svivav, right? God is surrounded by dense clouds. Megaleh amukot mini choshech, God draws mysteries out of the darkness, right? And so this person who wrote about this said, well, what happens if I think about God as being blind? And how does that impact on my understanding of God? And, what do I do with that? We can unshare right now so I can see people while I'm talking, because we got through the text. So if we think about these different views, like what if we take this idea of disability studies and extend it, not just to biblical characters, but to God in the Bible? How does that impact on our understanding of the Bible and on what we're trying to say here and the impact of disability on the biblical text? And there's more to say about that, but I think I don't want to take a lot more time on it right now because it's kind of like a separate topic. But I wanted to throw it in because I think it's important to recognize how incredible it is if we can actually look at the biblical text and say, not only do we have biblical characters who are our major heroes and have disabilities, but in addition to that, we can see that one of the metaphors or one of the images that is used for God is with God having a disability. And what does that say? And how do we understand that? And what does it say to us today? And what does it say within the Bible? So I want to try to bring this all together, and then we'll open for some more questions. There's a couple of different ways of understanding this. On the one hand, when we think about the idea of a tremendous amount of disability in the Bible, or I should say in the Torah for starters, we can just stick to the Torah, even though it is all over the Bible, but we can stick to the Torah for this minute. And we think about, especially, I do like to focus on Jacob, because Jacob specifically becomes someone who limps exactly when he becomes Israel. And that is that moment, right? Not only is Jacob the father of the 12 tribes, but Jacob is the one who becomes Israel. And it's at that moment that he becomes someone who limps. So somehow we are saying that the idea of limping or the idea of having a disability is part of the Israelite, being Israel. Now, what do I mean by that? When I think about this, I think about it in the context of the bigger picture of how did Israel see itself. And if you look in the biblical text, almost everyone of our, biblical characters who inherit are the younger son. They're not the older son. It's almost always the younger son. And what do we do with that? Well, when we think about it, somehow Israel's self-perception was of themselves as the younger son, right? No matter what kind of biblical history you're in, Israel was smaller, right? Israel was not going to be the size of Egypt. Israel was not going to be the size of the Mesopotamian kingdom. And it doesn't matter which kingdom, if it's Assyria, if it's Babylonia, those were always going to be huge, right? Assyria, Babylonia over here, Egypt over here. Israel's in there with a lot of small places. That's just what it was, basically in most time periods. All the more so when they were in exile. But even when they were not in exile, they were not going to be the ones who were stronger. They were always the ones who were successful despite being smaller. despite being the ones who were weaker, so quote unquote, or lower in social status, whatever it is, they still won out. So on some level, there's a message to Israel here that the Bible is giving. And whether you would want to see it in different times of biblical history, or whether it's relating even more specifically to Israel in Babylonian exile, which many people say a lot of the Torah was edited in the time of the Babylonian exile, which is the 6th century BCE. Somehow it's saying, you look like you don't have, right? You look like you don't have a land. You look like you don't have a temple. You look like you are just in a place that you don't have an identity anymore, even though they did, but that was a big deal. And yet, things are not as they appear to be. The one who looks like they don't have is the one who's going to succeed. The one who's the younger son that shouldn't be the one who inherits is the one who's going to inherit. Right? So in each of these places, there's like a concept of it looks like you don't have power, but actually you have a lot of power. And we see that a lot in terms of the younger son. And I think we can apply the same thing to the area of disability studies, that it's not just that Israel was the younger son, but Israel's almost the disabled younger son, the younger son that has to fight even harder to get their due or to succeed or to be the one who wins out. And yet they do, right? And yet they do win out, and yes, they do succeed. And so I think, so on the one hand, this picture from a biblical perspective is really saying, this is a message of hope to Israel. It could be a message of hope to individuals, and that's very nice too, but I think it's also a much bigger message of hope to Israel, saying it looks like one thing, but it's actually something else. Did I just get cut off? Oh, no, you're here. Sorry, my computer looked like I got cut off. Sorry. I thought I was talking to myself. And then, so on the one hand, it is a message of hope both to the individual and to the community. That's on the one hand. And that's kind of from the biblical perspective. But I then want to push it to our modern perspective as well, which is to say, if we're able to say that our Bible is filled with individuals with disabilities, if we're able to say that we see images of God with disabilities, then what does that say to us about what Betzelem Elohim means, the image of God? And that our understanding of the image of God needs to continue to broaden, and needs to broaden and broaden and broaden. And if we are able to say that our idea of Betzelem Elohim is as broad as the human experience can possibly be, then we also have to act that way in our religious lives, in our creation of synagogues, in our schools, in our Jewish schools, in our camps, in our adult education, in everything that we do. That sense of inclusion, that sense of providing has to be considered just part of the directive to us in the Bible, just part of the message of Betzelem Elohim, being in the image of God. And that it's not something nice we do. It's not something, isn't that nice we provide this? It is actually absolutely a part of who we are and what we do. And what our mandate is as a Jewish people. So I want to open again to questions, comments, thoughts.
Thank you. Thank you for those beautiful words. Let me go back to a question that I had earlier on. Just the idea that I think it was one of the first texts that you shared, the notion that that God gave Moshe the disability, that it was, so that was, I think, troubling. So wanted to go back to that if you had anything else you wanted to
I'll tell you
add.
something. One of my hardest teaching experience I ever had, I remember it like it was yesterday. It was a long time ago. And I was still an early teacher. And I was teaching this text to a group. And this woman basically ran out of the room crying. And it was horrifyingly sad. And I felt terrible. Um, and she had just found out that her child was deaf and they were dealing with all kinds of stuff, and she didn't know how to deal with this theologically, to have this in the text. So it was just so sad. Like I really remember it so well because it was so sad and I felt terrible. But in essence, that's what God is saying here, right? Me sam Mi sam pela adam o mi yasum ilem o cheresh o pikech o iver halo anochi Adonai. God is saying, I'm the one who does this. Like it is a so it's powerful, it's sad, it's theologically difficult, and yet at the same time, it is saying that, God is above and God is in charge of everything. And that in some way, it's actually just saying this is part of the human condition. Like none of us would have trouble saying that God gives some of us blonde hair and some of us brown hair, right? We wouldn't have trouble saying God makes some of us 6'2" and some of us 5 feet. Because we don't put value statements on those in the same way. But suddenly it's hard to say this because we put value statements on it. And so I think some of the theological problem is ours. And yet I feel bad saying that because life is harder. It's not fair to say, oh, it's not harder to have a disability. It's fine. It is harder. Like we should be willing to say that there's stuff that's harder. So I really understand the theological difficulty. I really, really do. And yet this is what the Bible is saying, like that this is just another part of being human, and God is responsible for that too. I don't know if that helps you at all.
Thank you. Um, I think you've just left us with a lot to think about, and there's so much to connect with, and like the different layers of things that you brought up. So I really appreciate your teaching us today.
Oh, thank you so much, and really nice to see everybody.
Thank you everyone for being here, and also just wanted to announce one more time that we're going to be meeting again in September for our High Holiday webinar series. And I also wanted to thank once again our sponsor today, Barbara Hoffman, who sponsored the session in loving memory of her daughter, Carolyn Chaya Hoffman. Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Take care, everybody.